A racist teacher named Mrs. Oliver humiliates a black student, Sammy, in front of the entire class, breaking his spirit. Years later, Sammy Thompson returns to school as an unexpected success. What happened at the reunion will leave you in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sammy Thompson jumped into Mrs. Oliver's class with his backpack swinging behind him and his eyes bright with joy. He was excited to learn new things, especially in math, on the first day of 4th grade. He loved the way numbers made him feel. Mrs. Oliver said, "Good morning, class," but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Please find your seats," the teacher said. Sammy sat down at a desk near the front, ready to listen carefully. He got his notebook and pencil out and was ready to start when Mrs. Oliver started teaching the multiplication tables. Over and over, Sammy's hand went up. He knew the answers and wanted to share them. He was proud to say, 7 times 8 is 56, when Mrs. Oliver pointed to him. But Mrs. Oliver's lips got tight. Instead of being happy for her, "Sammy, we raise our hands and wait to be called on in this class. You're disrupting the others." Sammy's cheeks were red. He wasn't trying to be a bother, but he loved numbers so much. During group work, Sammy was excited to share his thoughts with his classmates, but Mrs. Oliver walked over with a fake sweet voice. "Sammy, dear, why don't you let the others have a turn? You don't want to show off, do you?" Sammy felt sick to his stomach. His only goal was to assist, not to draw attention to himself. As the days went by, Sammy became less and less excited about math class. She would sigh or roll her eyes every time he raised his hand. She would say, "Yes, Sammy," in a way that made him feel little. It was hard for Sammy to figure out what he was doing wrong. Besides math, he loved to learn everything. But Mrs. Oliver told him he shouldn't. As Sammy worked out a tough board problem one day, he heard Mrs. Oliver say, "Well, I guess even a broken clock is right twice a day." This made Sammy feel bad. He had no idea what that meant, but it felt bad. He slouched back in his chair, hurt and confused. Sammy's peers started to notice something wasn't quite right as the weeks went by. They saw that Mrs. Oliver didn't treat Sammy the same way she did the other kids. Every time Sammy did something stupid, like forgetting to bring an extra number with him, Mrs. Oliver would sigh loudly and shake her head. She would say in a sharp voice, "Sammy, you need to pay more attention. You should know better by now. This is simple math." But when Olivia or Michael did the same thing wrong, Mrs. Oliver would smile and say, "That's okay, sweetie. Let's try again together." The other kids looked at each other like they didn't understand. It was clear to them why Mrs. Oliver was being so mean to Sammy. He was good to everyone and did his best in school. While Sammy was at recess one day, some of his friends huddled together and whispered. Lisa asked with wide eyes, "Did you see how Mrs. Oliver yelled at Sammy for dropping his pencil?" Tommy said yes. "Yeah, but when I spilled water all over my desk. Yesterday, she just helped me clean it up and didn't say anything mean." The kids felt bad for Sammy, but were afraid to say anything. They were in Mrs. Oliver's class, so who were they to question her? Sammy saw that his friends were acting strangely around him. When he walked by, they looked sad at him and sometimes whispered. He felt alone and lost because of it. He began to think that maybe he wasn't aware of what he was doing wrong. Sammy would lie in bed at night and think about his day. "Maybe if I try even harder, Mrs. Oliver will like me," he said. But nothing changed, no matter how hard he worked or how carefully he followed the rules. Sammy tried to ignore these sad thoughts, though. He loved school too much to stop. He would take a deep breath every morning and tell himself, "Today will be better. I'll do my best, and that's what matters." But as the day went on, and he saw Mrs. Oliver complimenting his classmates while ignoring him, it became harder and harder for him to believe those words. Mrs. Oliver called Sammy to the blackboard as the math class went on. "Sammy, let's see if you can figure this out," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. He took a deep breath and made his way to the front of the class. As he picked up the chalk, his hand shook a little. A simple math question was written on the board for him to look at. Sammy was sure he could do it because he had worked hard at home. He carefully wrote down the steps the way he knew how to do them. But his nervousness got the best of him as the end got closer. He forgot to carry over a number, which was a small mistake. Mrs. Oliver's eyes got very dark. "Oh, Sammy," she said, in a sharp, loud voice. His face turned red as he said, "How many times do we have to go over this? Can't you do anything right?" He was embarrassed and felt small as he stood there with the chalk still in his hand. It was seen by the whole class. He said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Oliver," and then he looked down at his shoes. "Sammy, saying sorry doesn't fix careless mistakes," Mrs. Oliver said next. "Maybe you wouldn't look so bad if you paid more attention in class instead of daydreaming," the teacher said. The other students moved in their seats uncomfortably. They looked at each other with eyes that were both confused and worried. What was wrong with Mrs. Oliver being so mean to Sammy? It was only a small mistake. Lisa slowly raised her hand. "Mrs. Oliver, I think I made the same mistake yesterday, and you?" Mrs. Oliver told her, "That's enough, Lisa. We're focusing on Sammy right now." It looked like Sammy was tired as he walked back to his station. He thought that everyone was looking at him and thinking how stupid he was. She might have been right. He might not have been good enough. As Sammy sat down, he tried to hold back the tears that were about to come out. He looked down at his math book and couldn't make out the numbers. He felt more alone than ever at that very moment. The trees outside the classroom window lost their green leaves and gained bright orange and red ones over the course of the weeks. Inside, though, things were getting more and more tense for young Sammy Thompson in Mrs. Oliver's class. Sammy would go to school every day with a small bit of hope that things would get better. She always found ways to make him doubt himself, though, just like the sun rising. Sammy did his part in a group project very well. He carefully colored in a chart about fractions. Everyone stopped at their desks when Mrs. Oliver walked by to see how things were going. She smiled at the girl next to Sammy and said, "Great job, Emily." Sammy felt good because she said, "Your colors are so neat and tidy." He thought she would also say something nice about his work. But Mrs. Oliver's smile went away when she got to his desk. Her shoulders dropped as she sighed and shook her head. "Sammy, couldn't you have at least tried to stay inside the lines? It looks so messy." He did his best. He looked at his chart and saw right away that it was wrong in so many ways. The last time the class had a math quiz, Mrs. Oliver gave the papers back with a flourish. She told them, "Class, I'm so proud of how well you all did. Jake deserves extra credit for getting a perfect score." Jake smiled and took high fives from his friends. He looked at his work and saw that he had only missed one question, giving him a 95%. As Mrs. Oliver walked by without saying anything, his heart sank. Like the pond in the playground, Sammy's love for math started to freeze over as fall turned to winter. Once, he eagerly raised his hand to answer, but now, he kept it firmly on his desk. Because he was afraid of making a mistake and getting Mrs. Oliver's wrath for it. At home, his folks saw the change. Chunk's dad would ask, "How was school today, champ?" Sammy would say, "Fine," because he wasn't excited to talk about what he had learned in class anymore. In the hopes that Mrs. Oliver wouldn't see him, Sammy tried to shrink himself as much as possible. But she always did it, and her sharp eyes always found the smallest mistake. As the winter days got shorter, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson could no longer ignore how Sammy had changed. Their boy used to come running in the front door, full of stories about his day, but now, he walked in quietly, his eyes sad. At dinner one night, Mrs. Thompson and her husband looked at each other worriedly. as Sammy picked at his food and barely touched his favorite mashed potatoes. She asked Sammy in a sweet voice, "Is everything okay at school?" Sammy just shrugged and used his fork to move a pea around his plate. He said, "It's okay." Mr. Thompson leaned in closer and rubbed his head in worry. "You know, you can talk to us about anything, champ. We've noticed you haven't been yourself lately." Sammy put down his fork because his bottom lip was shaking. He looked up at his parents with tears in his eyes. "I believe Mrs. Oliver," he said in a whisper, "doesn't like me." The heart of Mrs. Thompson squeezed. "What makes you think that, honey?" Sammy's words came out quickly. "She's always pointing out my mistakes in front of everyone. She never says anything nice about my work, even when I try really hard. I don't know what I'm doing wrong." Mr. Thompson reached across the table and grabbed Sammy's hand. "You're not doing anything wrong, son. Sometimes people just don't see how special we are." Mrs. Thompson said, "Yes," in a soft but strong voice. "That's right, Sammy, and no matter what, we want you to keep trying your best. We're so proud of you, and we know how smart and capable you are." Sammy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand as he sniffled. "But what if my best isn't good enough for Mrs. Oliver?" Mr. Thompson squeezed Sammy's hand and said, "Your best is always good enough. And we will always be here to support you, no matter what." Sammy stayed in his place until the last bell rang, which meant the end of another school day. His friends rushed out, excited to start the afternoon, but Sammy's heart was racing with worry. He held on tight to his math notebook as he worked up the courage to walk up to Mrs. Oliver's desk. He took a big breath, got up, and walked to the front of the class. Mrs. Oliver had her back to him as she erased the blackboard. "Could I ask you a question about today's lesson?" Sammy asked Mrs. Oliver, his voice shaking. Mrs. Oliver changed the way she looked. "What is it, Sammy?" Sammy took out his notes and pointed to a problem he had been having a hard time with. "I don't understand how to solve this one. Could you please explain it to me?" Mrs. Oliver took a quick look at the problem and then back at Sammy, making a thin line with her lips. "Sammy, we went over this in class today. You should have been paying attention." Sammy's face got sad. "I was trying to, but I got confused." "And if you had been listening properly," Mrs. Oliver said, "you wouldn't need to waste my time. After class, I can't hold your hand through every little problem." Sammy had tears in his eyes that wouldn't quit. He gave a quiet nod and put his notebook away. As she turned back to the blackboard, Mrs. Oliver said, "Now, if you don't have any other questions, I have work to do." His shoulders sagged as he walked back to his desk. His mind was spinning with thoughts of failing and not being good enough as he slowly packed his bag. He felt heavy in the chest as he walked out of the classroom. It seemed like everybody was following him. Sammy leaned against a wall of lockers in the empty hallway and tried to hold back the tears that were about to fall. He worked up the courage to ask for help, but was laughed off and told he was stupid. He was no longer excited about math class at all. Instead, he felt more and more afraid and doubtful of himself. Sammy wasn't sure if Mrs. Oliver would ever think he was good enough or if he would always fail. As the weeks went by, Sammy's friends, who used to be friendly with him, started to avoid him. He often found himself sitting by himself during lunch breaks. He used to be eager to join in with their games and talks. But now, the other kids look at him warily before getting into their own groups. One day, as Sammy walked up to a table where some old friends were sitting, he heard them talking quietly. "Here comes Sammy," one of the boys said, his eyes moving around worry. Someone else responded, "Quick, act busy," and all of a sudden, he was very interested in his sandwich. As soon as Sammy realized they were dodging him on purpose, his heart sank. As he turned away, tears were running down his face. In the corner of the canteen, he saw an empty table. While he ate his lunch alone, Sammy couldn't help but think about why his friends were being mean to him. It occurred to him that they might be afraid to be around him. because they thought Mrs. Oliver would treat them badly if they stayed friendly. Everything about Sammy's school life started to feel lonely. He was usually the last person picked for group projects, if he was picked at all. He walked around the field by himself during recess and watched his friends laugh and play from afar. Sammy's grades suffered because he was alone all the time. He used to be excited to learn, but now it was hard for him to concentrate in class. It was hard for him to focus on his studies because he was always afraid that Mrs. Oliver would pick on him, and he felt lonely. Sammy's grades started to drop in classes where he used to do really well. Mr. Johnson, his science teacher, saw the change and talked to him about it one day after class. Mr. Johnson asked Sammy in a soft voice, "Is everything okay? I've noticed your grades have been dropping lately." Sammy gave his teacher a worried look, but couldn't meet her eyes. He said, "I'm fine," but he didn't really feel that way. There was extra weight in Sammy's bag that afternoon because of all the problems he was having. The self-doubt that started in Mrs. Oliver's class had now spread to all of his classes, making him doubt his skills in every one of them. As the school year went on, Mrs. Oliver continued to subtly hurt Sammy's trust. She told the class one day that there would be a group exercise. The kids were very excited and couldn't wait to work with their friends. Sammy's heart was racing because he hoped this was a chance to see his peers again. "All right, class," Mrs. Oliver said, her voice clear over the other people talking. She began to call out names, and Sammy was eagerly waiting to hear his. "I'll be putting them into groups today," she said. His heart sank when she finally got to him. "Sammy, you'll be working with Tommy and Lisa," Mrs. Oliver told her, pointing to two students who were known to have trouble with math. He looked at Tommy and Lisa and saw that they looked just as uncomfortable as he did. He knew they were nice, but they needed extra help with math a lot of the time. It was clear that Mrs. Oliver thought Sammy was on the same level as them. Sammy did his best to stay upbeat as the group got to work. "Okay, guys," he said with a fake smile. "Let's work on this together." But as they did the task, Mrs. Oliver stayed close by, constantly reminding Sammy that he thought he wasn't good enough. Mrs. Oliver would always speak up when Sammy tried to explain an idea to his group members. When she talked to Sammy, she would say in a condescending way, "Are you sure that's the right way to do it? Maybe you should let Tommy try." It got harder for Sammy to stay strong with each attack. He started to doubt every answer and idea he gave the group. He lost all faith in his math skills because Mrs. Oliver was always looking at him closely. Sammy became less excited as the action went on. Even though he knew what to do, he pulled away and let Tommy and Lisa steer the conversation. It seemed easier to keep quiet than to deal with Mrs. Oliver's doubts. Sammy felt down by the end of the class. He no longer enjoyed solving math questions as much as he used to. Instead, he felt deeply inadequate. He looked at the bright stickers on his math notebook as he put his books away. They reminded him of when he loved learning, and every problem he solved felt like a victory. He felt like those stickers were making fun of him. Once a bright spark, Sammy's desire to learn had dimmed to a flicker. He couldn't help but think, as he left the classroom, if he'd ever be that excited about math or any subject. Even though there were problems, Sammy's drive didn't change at all. He came home from another bad day at school and sat down at his small desk, which was full of math books and homework. He worked hard on problem after problem, giving himself a furrowed face. "I can do this," Sammy told himself in a low voice, as he quickly moved his pencil across the paper. "I just need to try harder." When his mom saw that the light in his room was still on, she went in. "Sammy, honey, it's getting late. Don't you want to watch your favorite show?" Even though his eyes were tired, Sammy looked up. "Not tonight, Mom. I need to finish these math problems." Mrs. Thompson's face turned soft with worry. Her son had been having a hard time in school lately, so seeing him work so hard made her feel bad. "All right, sweetie. Don't stay up too late, okay?" Sammy said, "Yes," and went back to work. He worked hard on his math books every night, thinking that Mrs. Oliver would finally see how smart he was if he just studied enough. Sammy's hand went up quickly when Mrs. Oliver asked a question in class the next day. "Yes, Sam," she replied, but her voice was already tense with doubt. "The answer is 42, Sammy said with confidence, since he had worked on questions like this the night before. It looked like Mrs. Oliver was angry. "Well, Sammy, that's correct, but you didn't show your work on the board. How can we be sure you didn't just guess?" Sammy's face got sad. In his rush to get the right answer, he forgot to write down the steps. I can show you now," he said shyly. "No need," Mrs. Oliver told him, and waved him off. "Let someone else show us how to solve the problem correctly," someone else said. While that person went to the board, Sammy slouched in his seat. It seemed like Mrs. Oliver could always find something bad to say about him, no matter how hard he tried. His self-esteem was slowly being harmed by the constant criticism. As Sammy walked home that afternoon, though, he still felt a little bit of hope. Things might be different tomorrow. I think Mrs. Oliver would finally understand how hard he was trying if he worked even harder. Sammy was still hoping that things would get better, even though he was being treated unfairly. There was a mix of joy and worry in the air as the school year came to a close. While other students talked about their plans for the summer, Sammy Thompson had a knot in his stomach. Report card day was coming up, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get rid of the feeling of dread. Samantha's hands were shaking as she gave out the sealed papers from Mrs. Oliver. He didn't open it until he was by himself. As he looked over the page, his heart was racing. The grades were much worse than he thought they would be, and much worse than he thought he deserved. Sammy's eyes got teary. All those late nights studying, all the extra practice questions he'd done, it felt like none of it had mattered. Mrs. Oliver was nice, but she kept her cool when she said that Sammy needed to improve in a number of areas. Sammy walked home with slouched shoulders because he was so upset. His small frame felt the weight of his sadness. He worked so hard and went all the way to the end. It wasn't enough. Still, he thought about giving up for a moment. The point of trying was lost if no one saw him. But as Sammy sat on his bed and looked at the report card, something inside him moved. A quiet resolve began to grow. He thought about what it would be like to be ignored and have his promise thrown out. He thought about other kids who might be going through the same thing. Sammy promised himself in his head that he would become a teacher one day, but not just any teacher. He'd be the kind of teacher who always saw the best in pupils. His class would never feel the way Mrs. Oliver made him feel again. He would cheer them on and excite them. Sammy's eyes lit up with new determination. He might not be able to change Mrs. Oliver's mind about him, but this could help him in the future. He was going to work hard and keep going until he made a difference in the lives of children. After many years, Sammy Thompson was at the front of his own classroom, watching his kids come in for the day with a warm smile on his face. The walls were covered with bright pictures and motivational sayings, making the room feel warm and friendly, very different from his childhood classroom, which was cold and scary. As the last student sat down, Sammy looked around the room at all the eager faces. He saw promise in every child, no matter where they came from or what skills they had. Sammy saw this as more than just a job. It was his calling. "Good morning, everyone," Sammy said in a soft but excited voice. "Today, we're going to tackle some challenging math problems. But remember, it's not about getting everything right. On the first try, it's about learning and growing together." Sammy went around the room at the start of the lesson and gave each student support and motivation. Sammy knelt next to Emily's desk and patiently led her through the steps when she was having trouble with a problem. The only prize Sammy needed was the smile on her face when she finally got it. Sammy later thought about his own school days when there was some peace and quiet while the other students worked on their own. He remembered how Mrs. Oliver's rude words hurt him, and how her slight bias had made him feel less confident. Sammy didn't feel angry, though. Instead, he felt deeply thankful. Those terrible events had changed him and made him the teacher he is now. Everything he did, from being kind to explaining things slowly, was a clear response to how he had been treated as a child. Sammy turned his pain into a goal and his sadness into a resolve. He looked at the kids in his class, who were hunched over their work and had hopeful looks on their faces. He saw parts of himself in each of them, eager kid who just wanted to learn and be liked. He saw the teacher he had always wanted in himself. Sammy stood in his living room the next day and stared at the envelope in his hands. The name of his old grade school was on the return address, which made him feel a lot of different things. He opened it with shaky hands and took out a shiny invitation to the school reunion. He remembered his time in Mrs. Oliver's class as he read the details. The slight bias, the constant criticism, and the feeling that he was never good enough came back to him like a tidal wave. The invitation was still tightly in Sammy's hand as he fell asleep on the couch. His heart was racing. He asked himself in a deep voice, "Do I really want to go back there?" At that moment, for some reason, the thought of seeing Mrs. Oliver again made his gut hurt. What if she was the same? What if those old thoughts of not being good enough came back? Sammy thought about the choice for days. He couldn't help but look at the invitation on his kitchen table. He was torn between wanting to avoid possible pain and wanting to know how his old classmates had done over the years. As Sammy marked papers in class one night, he looked up and saw a framed quote that said, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." He had put it there to remind himself every day of his job as a teacher. All of a sudden, he had an understanding. Not going to the gathering, wasn't he letting the things that happened in the past control him? He worked hard for years to become the teacher he wanted. He could use this chance to show himself and Mrs. Oliver how far he'd come. Sammy took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and called the number. "There? Yes, I'd like to give my RSVP for the reunion," he said, and each word made his voice stronger. As soon as Sammy hung up the phone, he felt stress go away. He was no longer that shy little boy. He was now Sammy Thompson, a well-liked teacher who had found meaning in his pain. As the evening of the reunion came around, Sammy found himself at the front door of his old grade school. He took a big breath, put his tie back in place, and went inside. Many older but still recognized faces could be seen in the hallways. In his way to the gym, Sammy heard a voice calling out, "Sammy! Sammy Thompson, is that you?" When he turned around, he saw Olivia, an old friend, smiling at him. Soon, a small group of people gathered around him and started chatting excitedly. They went to a quiet part of the gym and talked about old times. They told stories about their lives since grade school, which made everyone laugh. It made Sammy feel good inside to know how much he had missed these relationships. As the night went on, they always talked about things they had in common in school. Another old student, Tom, asked, "Remember Mrs. Oliver's class?" The group became quiet and looked at each other in a deep way. Olivia spoke up, but her voice was soft. "Sammy, we always noticed how Mrs. Oliver treated you differently. It wasn't fair." He could feel a lump in his throat. He didn't think that his old friends would remember this so well, or even bring it up. "Yeah," Mark replied, "even when you did something right, she was always so hard on you. It was like she had it out for you or something." The other people nodded and looked sympathetic. It moved Sammy that they cared, even after all these years. Olivia leaned forward and asked Sammy, "How did you do it? How did you manage to become so successful despite everything Mrs. Oliver put you through?" Sammy stopped and thought about what to say. He looked around at his old classmates, who were all waiting to hear how he had dealt with the unfair treatment he had been through. Sammy took a moment to collect his thoughts. He looked at his old friends with misty eyes. They cared about him and understood him, which touched him deeply. I didn't know you all noticed," he said in a soft, emotional voice. Back then, thought I was alone in feeling that way. Olivia put her hand out and squeezed his. We were just kids, Sammy. We didn't know how to help, but we saw it. We all did. The memories that Sammy's friends told him made him feel a lot of different things. It made him feel good to know that he hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the unfair treatment. But it made him very sad because he missed being a little boy and didn't understand why his teacher seemed to dislike him so much. Sammy said, "It was hard," but his voice was barely above a whisper. "There were days I didn't want to go to school. But I guess, in a way, it made me stronger. It made me want to be better." The older woman who had stopped near the group didn't get any attention from the others as they talked. Now that she was retired and had gray hair, Mrs. Oliver stood still with her hand tightly gripping her punch cup. She had gone to the gathering to remember the years she had taught, and to see how her old students had changed. In its place, she was faced with the painful truth of the harm she had caused. While Sammy and his friends talked about how she treated him, Mrs. Oliver felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. When she realized how much pain she had caused young Sammy, hit her like a punch. She remembered the times she had ignored Sammy's raised hand, and the times she had scolded him more strongly than others. At the time, she told herself that her actions were right, but she never admitted that they were based on bias. Now that she heard Sammy's hurt voice and his friends' worries, she could no longer lie about what she knew to be true. When Mrs. Oliver's hands started to shake, her punch fell to the floor. Sammy and his friends heard a noise and turned around to see their old teacher standing there. She had a pale face and big eyes because she was shocked and sorry. As Mrs. Oliver held her empty punch cup, she stood still. Her hands were shaking. The weight of what she had done in the past hit her hard, leaving her short of breath and feeling bad about herself. She had never fully faced how her actions had affected young Sammy. She was always looking for reasons to defend them. Hearing his peers talk about it in such a direct way, she could no longer hide the truth. The retiring teacher couldn't stop thinking about how she had treated Sammy, how she had talked down to him, criticized him harshly, and made him feel less confident in small ways. Every memory made her heart feel like it was being stabbed. How could she not see how biased she was? When Mrs. Oliver realized what she had done, she felt a terrible guilt that almost overtook her. She had done badly as a person as well as a teacher. It was clear that she had hurt Sammy, and the thought of having to face him now made her feel scared. Sammy was looking at her with a mix of surprise and doubt in his eyes as she looked at him quickly. Mrs. Oliver got red, even thinking that she deserved to be put down in public. "Don't you remember that she did that to Sammy all those years ago?" It was in her mind that Sammy would stand up, point the finger at her, and tell everyone all about her flaws. She could almost hear him telling her about every wrong, every unfair comment, and every time she put him down for no reason. Mrs. Oliver jerked back as if she had been hit by the force of Sammy's possible words. The scene she was picturing was so real. When she thought about the time when Sammy would let out all the hurt and anger that had been building up for years, her heart raced. She felt open, weak, and completely deserving of the shame that was about to happen. But Sammy's voice was soft and warm when he talked to Mrs. Oliver. With a soft smile, he asked, "Mrs. Oliver, it's been a long time. How have you been?" The eyes of Mrs. Oliver popped open in surprise. She looked at Sammy with wide eyes, hoping to see any sign of the anger or hatred she thought he would show. Instead, she only saw kindness in his eyes. The calmness with which he acted made her silent for a moment. She spoke very slowly and barely above a whisper, "I'm well, thank you." Following everything she had done to him, she couldn't understand how Sammy could meet her with such warmth. The guilt that had been pulling at her got worse, making her feel like she deserved his care even less. Sammy said, "Yes," and his smile never left his face. "I'm glad to hear that. You know, I've thought about you often over the years." She felt ashamed, and her face turned red. Sammy had been on her mind too, but she always felt a mix of sorrow and denial. With his sudden ease in front of her, she didn't know what to say. Sammy, she started, but her voice broke because she was so upset. But before she could say anything else, Sammy put a soft hand on her arm. "It's okay, Mrs. Oliver," he said kindly. "We all have things in our past we wish we could change. What matters is how we move forward." As Mrs. Oliver listened to Sammy talk, tears started to form in her eyes. Because he was being honest, his words really touched her. He began, "Mrs. Oliver," in a soft but strong voice, "I won't lie and say that my time in your class was easy. There were days when I felt so small and unimportant." He paused and took a deep breath. Mrs. Oliver jumped because she thought the worst would happen, but what Sammy said next shocked her. "But you know what? Those experiences shaped me. They made me who I am today." Mrs. Oliver looked at him with eyes that showed she was confused. Sammy went on, "I decided that no child should ever feel the way I did. So I became a teacher. Mrs. Oliver, a teacher who sees the potential in every student and lifts them up instead of tearing them down." Mrs. Oliver felt so much better after hearing what Sammy said, but it hurt her deeply. "Every kid in my class knows they're important," Sammy said, with pride in his eyes. "When a student struggles, I remember how it felt to be in their shoes. I use that memory to guide them, to show them that they're capable of greatness." There was a lump in Mrs. Oliver's throat. She wanted to say sorry, but she couldn't find the words. Sammy gave a small smile. "I won't lie and say it was easy. There were times when I wanted to give up, but then I'd think about the teacher I wished I had, and that gave me the strength to keep going." At that moment, Mrs. Oliver did not see the shy boy from her class, but a sure of himself, kind Mana teacher who had changed the hurt from his past into a force for good. Finally, Sammy said in a friendly voice, "Mrs. Oliver, I have you to thank. Your class taught me how to be the kind of teacher I wanted to be by showing me how not to be one." Mrs. Oliver just stood there, speechless. From what Sammy said, it was more than she had ever expected or thought she deserved, for him to forgive her and understand her. As she tried to find the right words, her chest tightened. Sammy looked at her with sympathy in her eyes, which were filled with tears. "I don't know where to begin," she said, in a shaking voice. "Sammy, what I did to you was unacceptable." She paused and took a shaky breath before continuing. "I let my own biases and frustrations cloud my judgment. I treated you unfairly, and I deeply regret the pain I caused you." Mrs. Oliver wiped a tear from her cheek. "I was supposed to nurture and encourage you, but instead, I tore you down. I failed you as a teacher and as a human being. I'm so sorry." Sammy paid close attention, and with each word, his face became softer. Their apology from Mrs. Oliver hung in the air, heavy with years of pain and sadness that had not been spoken. Sammy finally spoke after a short pause. His voice was soft but strong. "Thank you for apologizing, Mrs. Oliver. It means a lot to hear that you understand what happened." He took a deep breath, and then said, "You know, I carried the weight of those experiences with me for years. But I've learned that holding on to that pain only hurts me more." Sammy looked into Mrs. Oliver's eyes and saw that she saw a wise young man. "People can change and grow, Mrs. Oliver. I've seen it in my own students, and I see it in you now. Your apology shows that you've reflected on your actions and want to do better." Mrs. Oliver nodded, and tears started to flow easily. Sammy said, "I accept your apology, not just for my sake, but for yours too. We all deserve the chance to learn from our mistakes and become better people." While everyone else at the gathering was talking, Sammy and Mrs. Oliver found a quiet place to keep talking. As they talked more about their shared past and how it affected both of their lives, the music and talking faded into the background. As Mrs. Oliver leaned forward, her eyes were filled with both sadness and hope. "Sammy, I can't change what I did, but I want to understand. Can you tell me more about how my actions affected you? He took a moment to gather his thoughts before nodding. He told her, it was hard. For a long time, I doubted myself. I thought maybe I just wasn't smart enough or good enough. But as I grew older, I realized that those feelings came from how I was treated, not from who I was. Mrs. Oliver paid close attention, and every word made her heart ache. He then said, "That's why I became a teacher. I wanted to make sure no child ever felt the way I did in your class." Mrs. Oliver was moved by what he said and understood how much teachers could change their students' lives, for better or worse. "Sammy, you've turned a painful experience into something beautiful. You're the kind of teacher I should have been," she told me. Sammy gave a small smile. "We all have room to grow, Mrs. Oliver. What matters is that we recognize our mistakes and try to do better." Mrs. Oliver nodded, and her eyes were bright with purpose. "You're absolutely right, Sammy. I want to make amends. Is there any way I can support your mission of empowering students?" Sammy felt moved by how sincere she was. In her eyes, he could see a real desire to be forgiven. While they were still talking, Sammy's eyes lit up with a thought. He leaned forward, and his voice was pumped up with joy. "Mrs. Oliver, I think we have a real opportunity here. What if we could turn our shared past into something positive?" Mrs. Oliver gave him a strange look. "What do you mean?" "Well," Sammy said, "I've been thinking about opening a community center place where we could offer free tutoring for kids who can't afford extra help. We could make a real difference in their lives." Mrs. Oliver's eyes got bigger as she looked. "That sounds wonderful, Sammy. But how would we do it?" Sammy's excitement spread to everyone else. "We could start small. Maybe use the old community hall on weekends. We could recruit volunteer tutors, create study materials, and reach out to local schools to find students who need help." As Sammy talked, Mrs. Oliver got a lot of ideas. She could make things right and put her years of knowledge as a teacher to good use. "Sammy, I think that's a brilliant idea, and I'd like to help, if you'll have me." His face lit up with a warm smile. "Really? That would be amazing, Mrs. Oliver. Your experience would be invaluable." Mrs. Oliver nodded, and her eyes were bright with purpose. "Yes, I want to do this. It's time I use my skills to uplift students the way I always should have." They started to come up with ideas for their new business together. Sammy took a napkin from the table with drinks and began writing on it. Mrs. Oliver added her thoughts on the lesson plans and ways to teach. As expected, they both felt excited and like they had a reason for being there. What had been a terrible part of their lives was now setting the stage for something lovely and important. Their desire to help children brought them together in a way that neither of them could have imagined. Mrs. Oliver and Sammy Oliver were very excited about their new project. In order to make their dream come true, they planned for hours, called people, and met with local leaders. After being ignored for a while, the old community hall started to come alive as people got it ready for its new use. The natural charm of Sammy and the years of experience of Mrs. Oliver worked well together. They went to nearby businesses and asked for donations, passionately explaining their cause. A lot of people were touched by their story of healing and growth and were eager to help. As word got out about their project, people started to offer to help. People who used to go to school with both Sammy and Mrs. Oliver were among the first to sign up because they felt good about giving back to their community. Many people were interested in the strange relationship between Sammy and his old teacher, which brought even more attention to their cause. Mrs. Oliver was in charge of making the lessons, making sure they were interesting and motivating for the kids. Sammy focused on making the place feel friendly, so that every child who came in would know they were welcome and cared for. The reaction from the community was mostly positive. Parents were thankful for the free tutoring service, and schools were eager to work with them to find students who could use extra help. The center quickly became a source of hope for many families who were having a hard time helping their kids with school. Coming up on the first day of business, Sammy couldn't help but feel proud. Things that began as a chat at a school gathering turned into something truly special. His eyes lit up with purpose as he watched Mrs. Oliver lead a group of volunteers through a training session. It was clear that this new part of her life had also helped her heal. Neither of them missed the fact that their relationship had changed from one of pain to one of working together toward a common goal. As they worked together to make their dream come true, they often looked at each other with respect and understanding. When the community center was almost done, Sammy stood in the doorway of the main teaching room and looked at the bright posters and well-organized desks. He felt a warm rush of pride in his chest. He couldn't help but remember how small and unimportant he had felt in Mrs. Oliver's class. A close desk's smooth surface caught his attention. "Look how far we've come," he said to himself in a whisper. In his mind, Sammy thought about all the hours as a child he had wasted doubting himself, the tears he had shed in anger, and the goals he had almost given up on. He was now making a place where every child would feel loved and cared for. There was more to it than just a building. It was a promise to himself as a kid, and to all children who had ever felt left behind. Moving slowly and carefully, Mrs. Oliver was putting books on a shelf across the room. Sammy looked at her for a moment, amazed at how their relationship had changed. He was now on this amazing journey with the woman who had once made him feel the worst about himself. Mrs. Oliver looked at Sammy and turned around. The way she smiled gave off a real friendliness that Sammy would never have thought possible years ago. He saw more than just Mrs. Oliver in that smile. He saw a woman whose life had new meaning. When she called out, "Sammy," her voice was soft from feeling. "I can't tell you how much this means to me, to be able to make things right. To help children in the way I should have helped you. It's given me a reason to get up every morning." Sammy walked up to her and put a soft hand on her shoulder. "We're both healing through this," he stated, "and we're going to help so many kids along the way." As they stood there, surrounded by the hope of fresh starts, Sammy felt very satisfied from the inside out. He had turned the hurt of his past into something beautiful that would change many people's lives. As she stood next to him, Mrs. Oliver showed that people could change, grow, and be forgiven. Sammy couldn't believe what he was seeing when the community center opened for the first time. There was a line of families waiting to get in that went down the block. Kids of all ages held on tight to their parents' hands. They looked scared and excited at the same time. As Sammy cut the ribbon that made the doors open for business, he felt a lump form in his mouth. He had worked so hard for this moment, for a long time. Mrs. Oliver stood next to him, her eyes shining with happy tears that she hadn't shed yet. His voice was filled with joy as he said, "Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here." As more families came in, the center was filled with laughter and talk. Sammy and Mrs. Oliver walked through the crowd, saying hello to parents and getting down on their knees to talk to kids face to face. They talked about the different programs and tools that were out there, and their excitement was contagious. In the main teaching room, Sammy sat down with a young boy who looked a lot like him when he was that age. Sammy carefully explained a math problem to the child, using colorful blocks to help them understand better. The child's eyes were wide with wonder. A little while ago, Mrs. Oliver was working with a small group of kids across the room. She was leading them through a reading activity with her soft voice. Sammy looked at her, and they both smiled. It was a moment when they knew they were exactly where they needed to be. As the day went on, the center was always busy. A helper helped a teen with her science homework in one corner, and a group of younger kids gathered in another for a story time. Parents went to classes to learn how to help their kids learn at home. Sammy and Mrs. Oliver were tired, but happy by the end of the day. They helped a lot of families and gave hope and support to those who needed it the most. The center had really become a lighthouse in the neighborhood, a spot where everyone felt welcome and important. The community center grew into a lively place for learning and growth over the course of a few weeks. It turned out that Sammy and Mrs. Oliver had to work together, and their relationship got stronger every day. The teacher-student relationship that used to be tense had turned into a strong partnership that worked together to help others. After being filled with shame for a long time, Mrs. Oliver started to feel better through her work at the center. She felt a little less guilty about what she did. In the past, every time she helped a student who was having trouble understanding something, the kid's happiness when they did well made her think of the teacher she had always wanted to be. One afternoon, Mrs. Oliver was very excited and said, "Look at this, Sammy." She showed off a math sheet with neat, right answers written all over it. Jenny finally understood fractions. She was so proud of herself. Sammy smiled, feeling the same happiness as Mrs. Oliver. "That's wonderful. I remember how much Jenny struggled with that last week. Your patience really paid off." As they worked together, Mrs. Oliver's many years of experience helped Sammy learn new things. Now that her methods were free of bias and full of kindness, they gave her useful information. In response, Mrs. Oliver changed the way she taught because of Sammy's new ideas and fresh viewpoint. Sammy had a close bond with his students. He often saw parts of himself in them, like how eager to learn they were, but sometimes unsure of their skills. He made it his job to help them feel good about themselves and love learning. One day, Sammy saw a little boy named Marcus getting angry as he worked on a reading task. Marcus mumbled, "I can't do it," and his head hung low. Sammy put a soft hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You know, Marcus, I felt the same way when I was your age. But I promise you, with practice and belief in yourself, you can do anything." The boy looked up with eyes full of hope. "Really? You had trouble too?" Sammy agreed and told a bit of his own story. His words were heard by Mrs. Oliver, who was watching from across the room. She looked at him with eyes that were both admiring and sorry. At that moment, they both understood how far they had come and how much good they were doing it together. A shy young boy named Jack walked into the community center on a sunny afternoon. He held his backpack close to his chest, and his eyes were wide with a mix of wonder and fear. Mrs. Oliver saw him right away, and something about the way he was acting touched her deeply. As Jack walked up to the front desk, Mrs. Oliver had a strong feeling that she had been there before. The boy's eager, bright eyes and slightly nervous stance made her think of Sammy when he was that age. It was like seeing a ghost from the past, a live reminder of the things she had done wrong, and the chance she now had to fix them. Mrs. Oliver said, "Hello there," in a soft voice, as she knelt down next to Jack. "I'm Mrs. Oliver. What's your name?" The boy stuttered, Jack, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Oliver gave a warm smile. "Well, Jack, we're so glad you're here. Can you tell me what subjects you'd like help with?" Jack looked around the room quickly before returning to Mrs. Oliver. "Math," he said, in a low voice. "I'm not very good at it." It was like a punch to the gut when she heard those words. So many times had she heard Sammy say something similar, but she always laughed it off. She promised herself in her head right then and there that she would give Jack all the support and encouragement she hadn't been able to give Sammy. Mrs. Oliver took Jack under her wing over the next few weeks. She was patient with him and broke down hard problems into steps that he could handle. She praised his hard work and was happy for every little win, no matter how small it seemed. Jack began to grow as the days went by. With Mrs. Oliver's help, he felt more sure of himself, and soon he was able to handle problems that used to be too hard for him. The shy, unsure boy who had come into the center the first time was changing right in front of her eyes. One day, Mrs. Oliver started to cry as Jack solved a very difficult problem. She saw how proud Jack looked, and his smile was so bright it lit up the whole room. Jack was very proud of himself as he said, "I did it. I really did it." When Mrs. Oliver nodded, her heart swelled with a mix of happiness and sorrow. You certainly did, Jack. I'm so proud of you. Since Jack's story of success got around, people in the community started to notice the amazing changes taking place at the center. Parents talked happily to each other in the school pickup lines about how excited their kids were to learn again. People in the small town quickly told their friends and family about the center, and soon more families were looking for its services. Sammy was amazed by the line of eager kids and parents that went down the block one cool autumn afternoon. As he stood at the community center's front door, when he saw Mrs. Oliver smile and say hello to each family, he felt warm all the way through his chest. Sammy whispered to himself, "I never thought it would grow this way." He shook his head in surprise. As word spread about the center, local news outlets became interested. One day, a writer from the local newspaper came and scribbled quickly while she watched all the action. Several kids and parents she talked to all said great things about Sammy and Mrs. Oliver. "They're like guardian angels," one mom exclaimed through tears. "My son used to hate school. Now, he can't wait to come here every day." The story that came out of it called Sammy and Mrs. Oliver local heroes, and talked about how dedicated they were and how they were making the community better. As soon as the newspaper hit the stands, hundreds of people called the center to offer to help or give. Even though they were getting more praise, both Sammy and Mrs. Oliver stayed humble about their parts. Since they were being honored at a town council meeting, Sammy got up and spoke to the crowd. "Thank you for your kind words," he said, in a calm, honest voice. "But the real heroes are the students who come to us every day, ready to learn and grow. And let's not forget the parents, volunteers, and everyone in this community who has supported us. This center's success is a testament to what we can achieve when we all work together." Mrs. Oliver agreed and said, "We're just two people. It's okay. What's really making a difference is the work of everyone in this community working together." As the first year of the community center came to a close, Sammy and Mrs. Oliver planned a party to honor the kids' hard work. They thought about everything for weeks, from the preparations to the food, because they wanted the day to be special for everyone. The center was full of energy on the day of the party. The walls were decorated with bright flowers and streamers, and a big banner that said, "Congratulations, students," hung proudly over the door. As families poured in, they were filled with pride as they looked at the student work on show in the hallways. As people came in, Sammy stood by the door and smiled and shook their hands. His heart grew as he saw familiar faces walk into the room. Students who had been having trouble before were now standing tall and sure of themselves. Mrs. Oliver, meanwhile, moved from group to group, giving each student words of praise and support. As she listened to parents talk about how their kids were doing, tears were still in her eyes. When everyone was quiet, Sammy walked up to the homemade stage they had set up. "Welcome, everyone," he said, with a tear in his eye. "We're here today to celebrate not just academic achievements, but personal growth, determination, and the power of community." Sammy was the first person to speak, and then Mrs. Oliver took the mic. As she walked up to the microphone, she took a big breath, and her hands started to shake a little. All eyes were on the woman who used to be known for being very strict. The room went quiet. Mrs. Oliver started, "First, I want to thank all of you for being here today." Her voice was a little shaky. "Many of you know that I haven't always been the best teacher I could have been. I messed up and let my biases get in the way of my judgment, which hurt some of my students." She stopped and looked for Sammy in the crowd. He smiled, and she said, "But standing here today, seeing all the wonderful things happening in this center, I'm filled with hope and gratitude. I'm committed to making a difference, to ensuring that every child feels valued and supported in their learning journey." Many people in the crowd wiped away tears as Mrs. Oliver spoke. Because she was honest and from the heart, her words moved everyone there. At the end of her speech, she told how grateful she was that the students, their families, and the community had supported the center's goal. As the months went by, Sammy and Mrs. Oliver continued to lead the community center to success. They worked hard to offer more services and were always looking for new ways to help the families they helped. As they sat in the center's small office one afternoon, Sammy came up with an idea. He asked, with excitement in his eyes, "What if we started holding workshops for parents? We could help them better support their children's learning at home." With a friendly smile on her face, Mrs. Oliver nodded. "That's great, Sammy, and maybe we could add some extra activities for the kids, like art classes or music lessons." They had a lot of ideas, and each one built on the one before it. As they talked, both Sammy and Mrs. Oliver were very thankful for how they had been able to work together. What began as a chance to make things right had grown into a real friendship and a task they both wanted to complete. They would carry out their plans over the next few weeks. At night, parents went to classes at the center on topics like supporting your child's reading and making math fun at home. The place was buzzing with new energy. The kids' eyes lit up with joy as they tried out new things in the art and music classes after school. At one point, Mrs. Oliver looked over at Sammy as they watched a group of students work on a bright mural together. "You know," she said softly, "this is something I never would have thought would happen when we met at the reunion again. Take a look at what we made together." Sammy agreed, but his throat was tight with feeling. "That's pretty cool, isn't it? We turned something terrible from the past into something beautiful that will last." As they stood there in quiet, enjoying the view of the kids laughing and making art, they both felt deeply satisfied that their work was truly improving the lives of these families. Sammy and Mrs. Oliver became closer as the center grew. They shared more than just their work. They shared their whole lives. They remembered each other's birthdays, told each other about their families, and helped each other through hard times. As things went well at the community center, Mrs. Oliver thought about the amazing trip she and Sammy had been on together. One afternoon, when it was quiet, she chose to show her appreciation in a real way. Mrs. Oliver carefully wrapped a small package, and her hands were shaking a little from emotion. Sammy was busy going over some paperwork in his office when she got there. She softly knocked and smiled as she came in. A soft voice asked, "Sammy, do you have a moment?" When Sammy looked up, he saw his friend and coworker, and his face lit up. "Of course, Mrs. Oliver, what's on your mind?" Mrs. Oliver walked up to his desk and held out the nicely wrapped package. "I have something for you," she said, in a warm voice. Sammy took the gift and looked at it with a puzzled look on his face as he opened it. His eyes got really big in shock. Inside was a beautiful framed picture of the two of them, shot at the opening ceremony of the center. People in the picture stood next to each other, their faces filled with pride and hope. "Oh, Mrs. Oliver," Sammy said, in a deep voice, full of feeling. As he ran his finger along the edge of the frame, he looked at every part of the picture. As Mrs. Oliver watched him, her eyes were still wet with tears. "I thought it was time we had a reminder of how far we've come," she said. "From where we started to where we are now. It's quite a journey, isn't it?" Sammy just nodded and couldn't say anything for a moment. The picture showed more than just a single moment. It showed how they went from being in pain to getting better, from being teachers and students to working together to make a change. Sammy looked up at Mrs. Oliver when he finally found his voice. He said, "Thank you," in a low voice. "This means more to me than I can express." Mrs. Oliver put a soft hand on his shoulder. "It means a lot to me too, Sammy. I never thought we'd be here, working together to make a difference in people's lives." They stood there quietly, looking at the picture together. Each person was lost in thought about their amazing trip during this quiet moment. The room was full of excitement as the community center's one-year anniversary party started. There were bright flowers and streamers on the walls, and happy people in every corner. Sammy was proud and thankful as he stood in front of everyone. He took a deep breath and walked up to the microphone. He looked around the room, and then his eyes fell on Mrs. Oliver, who was sitting in the front row. In a supportive nod, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. Sammy began, "Friends, students, and people from the community." His voice was warm and clear. "1 year ago, we opened these doors with a dream of creating a place where every child feels valued and supported." He took a moment to let what he said sink in. "Many thanks to all of you. That dream came true. But there is one person I want to thank more than anyone else." Sammy looked back at Mrs. Oliver. "Mrs. Oliver, would you please join me up here?" Mrs. Oliver was shocked when she got to the stage. Sammy grabbed her hand and gently squeezed it. "Mrs. Oliver and I have come a long way," Sammy said, his voice heavy with worry. "From my days as her student to now, working side by side. Her dedication to our shared mission has been nothing short of inspiring." Mrs. Oliver stood next to Sammy with tears still in her eyes. People in the neighborhood watched with rapt attention, and many of them nodded to show agreement. "Together, we've learned that it's never too late to make a difference," Sammy told me. "Thank you, Mrs. Oliver, for coming with me on this amazing trip. A lot of people have been affected by how much you care about our kids and this center." Mrs. Oliver felt a wave of feeling wash over her as Sammy talked. She looked out at the crowd and saw the faces of kids she had helped, parents she had helped, and people from the community who had welcomed her. Her heart was full of joy because this work had saved her. Sammy ended his speech with a voice full of hope and drive. "Let's remember that our work is far from over as we celebrate this important moment. We can do amazing things when we accept each other, work together, and decide to make a difference. This center is proof of that." The room erupted in cheers, and many people got to their feet. Mrs. Oliver, who had been forgiven and was now loved by everyone, stood happily next to Sammy and watched as his dream continued to grow right in front of them. Let me know in the comments section what interests you the most in this story. It takes me lots of time to put this story together for you. Kindly leave a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel and share this video. Also, check out our channel for more stories like this. Let's meet over there.